Thank you for this meaningful presentation, as usual. Some of your slides reminds me the places I saw when I went to Singapore when we met, along with some colleagues like Catherine Lejeune and also Delphine Pages, who was not able to join us. And so I will try to discuss, even if I'm not a geographer, I'm not, my field is not the field of migrations, but I would like to engage with you a broad conversation instead of discussion. And based on your contribution, as everyone knows, you are the author of a great amount of works on migrations, and not only migration. And I was not able to read all your work, of course, but some pieces, and I think this can give me the opportunity to engage the conversation on some specific topics, because there are some topics that you work on throughout your research. I think that there is the starting point of our discussion. I don't know if everyone can hear me.
Yes, they can listen. They can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
I'm on air. Okay.
Yeah, it's okay.
Hi, Catherine. I think that we can start from this definition of the global process, and independently of the scale of observation, we take the level of the analysis that we privilege and the meaning we attribute to the word globalization. I think that in your work, the mechanism of globalization is the simultaneous opening up and closing off of cultural, political, and symbolic boundaries that unite and divide social institutions, human communities, and individuals. This is the deeply paradoxical nature of globalization and its outcomes. And this is maybe one of the major contributions that you can provide us. This twofold process leads to the emergence of a global world which is both more inclusive and exclusive, integrated and fragmented, promising and frightening. That's why during our lunch we discussed about the existence of a global system of migration, but even the existence of the subsystems, the integration of some parts of the world, like East Asia or Mediterranean countries, or even the Americas, Africa, and so on. This is your understanding of globalization, and I think we share this main idea in our institute, and this is why your work matters to us. What is really understanding in your work, according to me, is your methodological and theoretical awareness that what is necessary today for social scientists is to explore the shape taken by this opening and closing of cultural boundaries. We have to see them together. It's not an antinomy, it's a paradox, which is different. And you try to understand the plurality of a globalized world, both at the micro and micro level. In this vein, you also work on the impact of globalization on the craft of the geographer. In my conversation with you, I think that we can try together to focus on one perspective that you use in your previous works, the perspective of cosmopolitanism. You know better than I that cosmopolitanism attracts more controversy than consensus, even for its champions. It poses a lot of paradoxes. It's often considered as a form of idealistic discourse, you know. It's a kind of prescriptive moral stance. And sometimes, you know, people think that cosmopolitanism is like, something that is good for pacifist, peace and love, anti-globalization movements. But it's very idealistic. In a way, I admit that cosmopolitanism is a loaded concept. it is full of an old and European history. It's also part of an Eurocentric vision of the world. Therefore, as powerful and compelling as it is, it should be approached with care, and with care, especially because the danger is to turn into a narrative without any empirical proof. This is a problem of cosmopolitanism. And to overcome these shortcomings, weakness, a cosmopolitan sociology should develop new tools that stems from global studies. This is precisely what we find in your works. In your work, I can see the ability to marry global studies and cosmopolitanism, which is very important for not only for me or for colleagues, for the institute, for your readers. You are aware that while globalization involves the comparative interaction of different forms of life, because thanks to globalization, migration, the consumption of cultural products, alterity, otherness is everywhere. In the past, alterity was far. Today, alterity, otherness is among us, even better. If you see our origins, or our ethnic origin, our religion, or not religion, or languages, this is a kind of cosmopolitan canopy in which we live. So globalization involves the comparative interaction of different forms of life, but it does not engender the spontaneous germination of cosmopolitan attitudes, orientation behavior. We can live in a global world, but this doesn't mean that the world is cosmopolitan. We can live in global cities, but not necessarily cosmopolitan cities. And this is also the case for, if we want to discuss about this, for a city like Singapore or even Dubai. They are very global, very super diverse. Are they cosmopolitan? This is another question. I leave this for the discussion with you. That's why, because you are aware of this, in your works, you insist on what I can see as the specific topic of study for a cosmopolitan approach. And this topic is the complex mechanism of the inclusion of the other. This is the main point of any sociology of cosmopolitanism and your work, of course. I will try to quote Ulrich Beck, who is maybe in Europe was the leading scholar working on cosmopolitanism. And what is interesting, if we compare your respective works, is that you have the same idea that cosmopolitan is about the internalization of the order. This is a major sociological set to describe what Beck called the cosmopolitanization of the world. Talks about this is because the order is internalized approach. This perspective of the inclusion of the order is ambitious. Because is the mean to provide sociology with powerful tools to explore the outcomes of globalization. Globalization is a very powerful mechanism, global mechanism. The outcome is that we have to face the question of the order. Everywhere, every one of us. It's also, in my idea, if I can add this, a convenient way to renew the discipline sociology, anthropology, and of course geography, because our disciplines are often accused of being Euro and Western centric. And it's a convenient way to renew the discipline to overcome this by taking into account non-Western sociological, anthropological theories and practices based on the dialectic between ego and us. This is a way to overcome the problem of cosmopolitanism and to compare what is happening in Singapore, in Dubai, in Paris, or whatever, in New York, etc. Okay, and I think also that from another point of view, I suggest, this is my idea, the inclusion of the other on an ethical and political level, the inclusion of the other provides a moral bulwark against xenophobic temptation and a political solution to combat the eruption of nationalist tendency. I'm not aware of what is happening in East Asia, but I do know that in Europe we are facing the return of a very strong nationalism, a return of xenophobia, Islamophobia, and also anti-Semitism, which is a great danger for, because you know how history, and you know what happened in Europe maybe 70 years ago. Nevertheless, it seems to me difficult to imagine what inclusion might entail, because this is maybe the major point of our work, of common work. That's why I prefer not to discuss with you, but to have a conversation. It's difficult to imagine what inclusion might entail. I know that when we read some scholars working on cosmopolitanism, they are very enthusiastic and they think that what is very easy to defend this approach by insisting on this the point of the inclusion of the other. I think we should recognize that this attempt is far from being self-evident, as we will see in your paper, in the paper you send us. Because the problem is maybe that cosmopolitanism is far from being able to understand complex attitudes towards the world and toward others. The inclusion of the other is very ambiguous. The relation that we have with others is ambiguous. And we cannot find a solution only if we are based on the idea that, we have to love each other. This is very easy. What is important for me in reading your works, that you emphasize the deep ambiguity of the relation to the other, which is simultaneously seen as a danger and a resource. Both. That's why the cosmopolitanism is complex. Because the relation between ego and other, it's a dialectic in the Marxist language, if I may. So it's, in a global world, the ego and the other can fall into the trap of a dangerous liaison, as we say in French, a dangerous link. In fact, the inclusion of the other is a demanding challenge. It's a very demanding challenge for a cosmopolitan approach, for geographers, anthropologists, sociologists, and so on. It's very demanding, and you investigate in depth the process of socialization that have been altered by globalization. This is what I really appreciate, among other things, in your works, in your papers. If the world is shared and plural, and otherness is ubiquitous, I insist in this point. Otherness is ubiquitous. When I went to Singapore, I saw there are a lot of different communities living side by side, saying goodbye, saying parts. In Europe, this is the common point of the global condition in which we live. And especially young people, but not only young people, especially students, but not only that. So otherness is ubiquitous, pervasive, and it's necessary to elaborate a specific methodological framework to understand how people, young people and even people, old people like me, how people are socialized to deal with the manifold forms of alterity. How people are socialized to confront, to face, to deal with difference. Because because I think that socialization today go beyond national borders. Even if you don't move, even you stay at home during the pandemic, you're always dealing with socialization because you have on your tablet Netflix, and because you want to connect with the, thanks to the platform capitalism, I have an account for my family, Spotify, Netflix, and so on. I can't remember because we have a lot, and I consume, even if I stay at home, I can't travel, and I consume a lot of K-drama, a lot of J-pop, a lot of American TV series, and so on. So today, socialization goes beyond national borders. Even if we are always located, as you show in your paper, you are aware that this socialization much more complicated because the scale of socialization are several of socialization of belonging, of course. And just for linger on this point, if I may, I think that thanks to your work, we can try to move toward the exploration of the concept of strangeness, and not only strange. This is what I think is very important in our research that we share today, even with the members of the Institute and Yeoh. I think the classical sociological approach to the stranger is based on the premise that in order to understand the stranger, it is necessary to study the individuals who arrive from the outside and are members of an external group. It's a classic sociology, geography. Everyone knows the even students. But I think that if I look at your work and also Chris Ramford, a sociologist who passed away some years ago, according to both of you, even according to Beck, although even if strangers continue to exist, of course, we are constantly reminded that mobility exists, migratory flows exist. Of course, strangers continue to exist, but I think we must now seek to understand within a more generalized category of strangeness. And in this category, the distinction between us and them becomes more problematic. This is one of the outcomes of the globalization, of the what I call the global condition of everyone. This is also what you do in your research when you show that strangers have a strong presence, but this presence is familiar, even a bit strange, if I may, but and they are always with us. At the same time, you know that contemporary avatars of the stranger have changed. They go beyond the traditional categories of migrants, expatriates, and refugees. Thanks to this change, new segments of the population are now part of the imaginary of strangers. Because now what is important is not that we have the idea of what stranger is. We have a strong imaginaries of strangers. It's very compelling. And think about the call center employees who speak the same languages as you and me. They are familiar with the same products, but they may live very, very, very far from us. They have a strong accent. Well, I have a strong accent also, but this is not the point. But they are familiar with the products, and they are at the same time distant and close. Think also of domestic terrorists. You don't have this problem in East Asia for now, but we have this is our problem in Europe. But also that the presence of domestic, they are like us, especially if they are a citizen of our countries. So this is kind of the strangeness of the stranger. I want to finish, if I may, just maybe 2 minutes. I would like to mention a point that is also important to me, and that I also find in some papers of you and your fantastic talk. As you know, in the literature, the analysis of cosmopolitanism is based on one basic assumption, one basic idea, The idea is, this is really the basis, that everyone shares. The idea is that when the ego is open to the others, because this is the starting point of cosmos, if you are not open, you are not cosmopolitan at all. My student asked me, what is cosmopolitanism? I answer, it's all about openness. So the idea is that we are open to others, exchange, unfold in a peaceful, symmetrical, reciprocal way. But this is what we think about the other. In our assumption, I think that this gentleman, I don't remember your name, so I'm open to him, but I expect that he is open to me, which is not at all, it's just my idea, but I don't know. So the idea of the inclusion of the other, the openness, posits that in this intentional openness, and everything is stemmed from this intentional openness. Some virtues as a positive emotions, empathy, benevolence, solidarity, hospitality. It's a kind of duty that we have towards others. And the point is, we always talk about the individual responsibility and never about the institutional responsibility. Institutions are accountable. I can be open to the other because I have my credit card, I can travel and buy, a product, or even have a Netflix on my iPad. This is a question of money. It's a kind of aesthetic, cultural cosmopolitanism. But we can ask people to have the same willingness to be open without a very strong international solidarity and institutional solidarity. We cannot leave people with the burden to have on their shoulders the responsibility of the inclusion of the Europeans. And this is the point. This is a very important point to discuss what we can the policies of cosmopolitanism, the policies of inclusion, the policies of hospitality. This is important because in Europe, this is now what is discussed by some xenophobic tendencies, populistic movements. They are trying to become the leader of the opinion on the question of migrations, on the question of religion, and so on. Okay. I think that we have to think about this because when we read the book of Elijah Anderson, The Cosmopolitan Canopy, it's a fantastic book. In this book, Elijah Anderson, he shows that in some situation, people can be open to the other and differences are neutralized in a spontaneous way. But for doing this, we need some special places. That's why I think that we have to have a reflection and analysis of what kind of institution policies can provide the possibility for people to be open to the others. Because cosmopolitanism is not only a choice, it's also a question of education. It's a question of education, to be educated, and also because it's instrumental. Why should I be open to the other? We have to avoid the zero-sum game between us and them. And so, I will finish because this was a conversation. I just have to question. Is a city in this life without citizenship, is a cosmopolis without legal assistance and recognition, is this sustainable? And the second question is, what kind of policies should be implemented to counter the issues related to the extension of transient migrations, because transient migration can be not only a solution for now, but as you showed us, even a problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Should I respond?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you for, in a sense, lifting the case study that was presenting to a larger canvas for discussion. And I think that's very fruitful because it then allows us to exchange ideas, even if we are not entirely familiar with the specificities, we can hopefully be able to discuss some of the common ideas. I think before coming to the two questions that has been posed, I just wanted to say that three things. One is that it's very important to look at globalization not as a flat world, but to understand that there are different migration regimes that in a sense are prevalent in different parts of the world with different outcomes. So in that sense, it's not a question of depending on Western theory or Eastern theory, but in a sense looking at theoretic constructs that are suitable to a particular regime of power. So every migration regime basically has its own norms, its own discourses, and its own practices. So we need to, in a sense, understand different systems of migration and their effects within place. That's my first comment. The second is that I think you very rightly pointed out the importance of scale, of looking at, of doing research that in a sense addresses multiple scales, from the micro scale at the ground level to the larger geopolitics. Everything is in a sense involved in any one process, and it's important to be able to capture this politics of scale that moves from the body to, as you say, to the community group, to the nation state, and to the larger global system. And the third point I want to make is that I think you have a very complex grasp of what cosmopolitanism and strangeness mean. And I also agree that cosmopolitanism is an important vision. It needs to be stripped of its Eurocentric kind of tendencies. But at the heart of it all, as Appiah says, is about thinking, I think what is the thinking nothing human aided, right? So the idea that as long as we are human beings, there is always this possibility of connection, even if we speak different languages and have different ideas and different backgrounds, there is the possibility of connecting if there is a human desire to do so. So I think that is something that we mustn't lose completely in thinking about this a world full of many problems and difficulties. At the same time, that is, as you say, not enough. It's also important to look at the larger structural conditions that can foster or, in a sense, dampen this kind of human spirit to connect. And these kinds of structural issues need also to be addressed at the institutional level, at the nation state level. The pandemic, of course, has shown us that the world has not learned to come together in unity in fighting a particular pandemic. It's in fact accentuated many of the differences. And what is very troubling is the knee-jerk nationalism that has taken place and become the way that we manage this particular pandemic. I mean, all nation states are looking to themselves first and foremost, without giving sufficient attention to everybody else. So that is, I think, an important arena that we need to focus on. Then coming to the more specific question, what should we do with the temporary migration regime that's in place as a prevalent system, not just in Asia, but the temporary migration regime is also something that is increasing around the world, seeing migrant labor as just labor, not human beings, to be welcome for their labor, but not welcome to, in a sense, stay. that kind of scheme is becoming more prevalent in all parts of the world. The statistics show that pathways to permanency is narrowing. These pathways, there are now very few opportunities of migrating to another country, settling a family there for good, unless you're highly skilled and highly talented. So for most people, temporary migration is growing faster, twice as fast, if I remember the statistics, as permanent migration. So what should we do? I mean, a big question for scholars like myself working in Singapore, where we confront these issues on a daily basis. Doing away with temporary migration is not going to be a simple solution towards that. So, but at the same time, the pandemic, and perhaps looking at the silver lining in the pandemic has also shown us that certain nation states, whole societies, cannot do without migrant workers. There's a lot of talk about automation and so forth, but it's very clear, at least in the Singapore case, that the global city-state is not going to be able to prosper without the contributions and labor of migrant workers. And that then provides, for me, a window of opportunity to do things differently. That's to say that, yes, and during the pandemic, and I know I'm just looking at the silver lining here, a few things happened. One is that the nation state realizes that you cannot, in a sense, treat the migrant workers as though they don't belong and keep them at distance, because the virus doesn't respect the fact whether you are a migrant or a citizen. So in terms of healthcare, for once, that was extended to migrant workers. They were given some priority in the vaccines, for example, for testings and for care. So in that sense, then that opens a little window that the NGOs have also, in a sense, seized upon to say that in the post-pandemic era, we should treat the migrant workers as though they're part of the national labor supply, not as outsiders who are only coming in on a temporary basis. And in that sense, the pandemic opened this particular window for us. So that's one, I guess, silver lining. And in terms of policies, it'll be important to think, as I said, think about safety nets for migrant workers and incorporating them into healthcare systems. Yes, there's still issues about incorporating them within society as full citizens, and that's probably going to take a very, very long time, but at least start with incorporating them into health systems. And the second thing that has happened under the temporary labor migration regime is that because borders are now closed or transnational mobility has stalled, travel back and forth has become very difficult, very dangerous, and very costly. It's no longer easy to repatriate somebody just because you want to, in a sense, end the contract. And also, many workers cannot come into Singapore and host cities. So in that sense, there's a major labor shortage in areas where citizens are not willing to perform the work. So that has then led to, I would say, a turn in the discourse. There's now some attention to migrant workers, not just as disposable labor, but as essential workers. So the terminology has shifted. Who is going to clear the rubbish? Who is going to construct your homes, right? Who is going to do elder care in the family setting? So I haven't done research during this period because of the conditions, but what I noticed is that the migrant workers are now in short supply, and they can now command better terms. So for domestic workers, for example, there's been an increase in their salary, right? Because they now are in short supply. You can't bring in more domestic workers from Indonesia and the Philippines. So those are within Singapore now, in a sense, can ask for better terms. It's still definitely not ideal situation, but there are glimmers of hope that in the longer run, hopefully temporary labor can be seen as essential as Singaporean labor, for example, and be part of the system. So these will be the directions that I think hopefully governments will be thinking about, not because of altruistic reasons, and sometimes to expect the government to act to embrace the cosmopolitan vision and to act on behalf of the migrants is sometimes very difficult because the ballot box basically, doesn't respond to migrants. So, but if you're thinking of the sustainability of a labor supply system, then in a sense, treating migrant workers as though they are not just strangers out there, but one and part of our whole humanity, that is, I think there's a glimmer of hope. I like to be optimistic. Yeah.
Which is very cosmopolitan. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Brenda, I think there are some questions from the room. Jean-Baptiste Meyer.
Okay. Hi to all of you, and thanks a lot, Brenda, for your presentation. Actually, we met like 15 years ago in Phuket with the JNU meeting that we had about highly qualified labor in Asia and the migration system. That was a great pleasure to listen to you again. And we did appreciate your presentation a lot. Just two questions. One about the comparison. Have you had the opportunity to make any historical comparison with, let's say, guest worker programs that Stephen Castles often mentioned, that there is nothing new in the migration system, because when we look at the past, we can see like this kind of a guest workers program that was kind of close to the description you made. And the apartheid system in South Africa a number of years ago had a lot of these discriminative urban settings that are close to those you are referring to today. The second question is about the civil society organization. I mean, you mentioned the neighbors and their reactions against these enclosures, and I wondered whether there were some associative processes, associations, NGOs that were raising the point in a very different way and reacting in favor and support of these migrant workers. And thanks again for the presentation, and I'll be very willing to listen to you again.
Thank you so much for those questions. I think the first one has to do with whether I've done any comparative work with other systems of temporary migration, like the guest worker system that was introduced in Germany and Europe. I haven't done any formal comparisons, but there's certainly many parallels between the two systems. I guess I'll just point to two. I'm not sure whether they are distinct differences, but something to think about. One is that my understanding, at least the German guest worker system, is that in the end, it didn't kind of work out because people stayed, and they're supposed to be guests, but they outstayed, so-called outstayed their welcome. Now that is not quite happening in Asia, partly because I think we now have much more sophisticated ways of governing migrant flows. So in that sense, technology and fingerprinting and all that means that there are actually very few overstayers in Singapore. So migrant workers, when they're repatriated, of course, some of them do try to overstay, but the system now is so sophisticated that it catches up with them. So the sense that you could, in a sense, from a guest worker become a sort of more permanent worker is less likely to happen. And remember what I mentioned in Singapore, they also don't have other routes to permanency. So like marriage, right? I mean, they're not allowed to marry Singaporeans or permanent citizens. So that particular pathway is also cut off. So that's one small difference, I would say. A second, more important issue is, again, I don't know enough about the European system, but the temporary migration regime in Asia is highly commercialized. That's to say that it involves migrant agents, the migration industry, brokers, agents, placement agents, recruiting agents. This is big time industry in Asia, trading in migrant workers. And this has now become so complex that the state sometimes outsource control to these migrant agencies to police the workers. So that is another, I think, major issue that needs to be taken care of. There is a third difference that I would like to mention in passing, which is the feminization of migration. Many of these migrant workers in Singapore and in Asia are domestic workers and care workers, and that tends to be women in a very gender segmented global economy, right? So I'll leave it at that. The next question, can you just remind me what was the next question? The NGOs and civil societies. So again, I guess every issue has a silver lining, and I must say that in the last 20 years or so, the silver lining is that from a society that had hardly any NGOs that would, in a sense, advocate for migrant workers, we now see migrant NGOs at the forefront, at the most progressive edge of civil society, I would say, in Singapore. So in that sense, I used to interview NGOs. I remember 20 years ago, and even the more sort of activist organizations would say, we are for citizens only. We don't look at migrant issues. That discourse has changed completely. And there is now the understanding that if you don't, in a sense, you want to advocate for the betterment of society, you have to, in a sense, include migrants and migrant workers. So that has been one outcome. I would say that during the pandemic, there's also a slight shift in the discourse, as I think I was trying to say, that from seeing migrants as, people who are disposable and at the very edge of society, within Singaporean society, and particularly amongst the younger people, I would say, my students, for example, they are very concerned about migrant welfare. Many of them have been involved in the different efforts during the times of the pandemic, especially when the dormitories are locked down, to provide care for these workers. Of course, as already said, these are not institutional measures. You still need institutional measures to be dismantled. But I would say the human spirit has been stirred, and there is hope that the pandemic will see a change in the way that migrants are treated in whole society. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Brenda. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Hello, Brenda. Glad to see
Hi.
I really enjoyed your presentation too, I want to say. And I had two questions. You partly answered as you responded, I think it was the impact of the pandemic. Before you gave several elements of sort of improvements, this window you've just, that has been opened. Mm-hmm. I was about to ask the question, were there workers repatriated, for example, because of the pandemic, etc.? But now I am under the impression that the situation has improved. So maybe you can tell us a little more about that. And the other, a very short question, you mentioned this struggle to obtain a day off, the struggle that migrants organized. If you could tell us a little bit about that, very interesting. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. It's great to see you. So I think for the first question, I've partially answered that. Because of Singapore's heavy reliance on migrant workers during the pandemic, when the borders are closed and border crossings became tricky, migrant labor was highly appreciated because there were delays in construction projects. There were issues to do with who's going to look after grandma if the domestic workers can't come. So in that sense, I mean, no one was actively repatriated in Singapore. So, from what I can gather, even during the height of the pandemic, the workers were given payments, they were given salaries. Maybe they were not able to earn overtime, you know, those kinds of extra money, but in terms of their basic livelihood, the Singapore government promised to and did deliver on the promise of making sure that no one is going to suffer in terms of not being able to send remittances home. So that part, I would say, is I guess, again, the silver lining in this very major traumatic times for the migrant workers. Of course, it's a terrible time for the migrant workers because they're locked down in their dormitories. Mental health has been a major issue for many of them. Yeah, I mean, because the borders are closed, not just on the Singapore side, but also in their own home countries, traveling back and forth to see your family is completely out of the question. Yeah, for many of them. On the second question, again, I need a trigger to remember.
The day off, the struggle to take.
The day off. Okay, so I mean, a decade ago, we already proposed, I mean, working with some NGOs, proposed that there should be a day off that's mandated for migrant domestic workers. So migrant domestic workers are not covered by the Employment Act in Singapore, which covers migrant construction workers. So construction work is seen as real work, right? But domestic work is seen as, you know, the kind of work that you do, that women do, basically, and not recognized as real work. So there is no day off, and many a times when asked, the government would say, because domestic work can't be defined, so you know you can't have a day off. But the NGOs worked towards this, and a few years ago, about 7 years ago now, they managed to, in a sense, the government proclaimed that there should be a mandatory day off every week, right? So all domestic workers now can, in a sense, theoretically claim a day off every week, and it's usually a Sunday. Except there is this clause. This clause says that if the migrant worker is willing, she can trade off her day off for payment. So that means that families, like for example, for elder care, where they feel that the elderly care recipient needs like days off every day of the week, may offer their workers day off, no day off if they pay a bit extra, right? So there's been a loophole, and again, I would say the pandemic has meant that workers are now able to ask for better terms. I do know, and this is anecdotal evidence, I do know of a few migrant workers who say that they will not take on the contract if there's no day off, even if they're paid more and they've gotten their way, right? So Singaporeans need to learn to cope on many employers tell me that if the migrant worker has a day off, then what about my day off? So there's another big issue here. Of course, if I go back to my gender roots of the argument, the whole problem with care, elder care and childcare is that in Singapore it's still seen as women's work. So it hasn't crossed the gender divide. So in that sense, when the female employer says, if I give the domestic worker a day off, who's going to look after grandma? The answer should be, well, perhaps you could spread it around the family and the husband could take on some of that work. That is often not considered. So in that sense, it's still very much a genderized occupation. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
No more questions?
Can I ask for me?
Yes.
Sorry, you're given attention. Yes.
Please.
Thank you so much. It reminded me of my own observation when I was in Singapore for 3 years as a postdoc.
Mhm.
And actually, I looked at domestic helpers because of my research involved family language policy and they bring Filipino or English to the home environment. So I looked at that. I'm just wondering about the social impact you talked about. I hear that you're working with NGOs rather than the government or institutions. Why is it like that in Singapore? And another comment is, why isn't Singapore learning from, for example, of course, here they call them au pair, not domestic helpers. For example, in Norway, au pairs, of course, they must have 2 days off. And also, as far as I know, their family must have a separate room to be able to recruit an au pair. So they have lots of rules and regulations, and they sign a very official contract. So these are the questions that, of course, I know the Singaporean government, how strict it is. But as a professor in US and EU, why aren't they really negotiating these with the government? NGOs in the intermediary agencies. I also know that I've had lots of stories from domestic helpers that like they give their 3 months salary in advance. They work 3 months free until they get settled in Singapore. So why isn't the government doing anything like something serious?
I mean, so the question. I think that is a very natural question, and it's one that I think all of us ask at every point. Just to maybe add a little bit to the salary deduction issue. So this is the point here is that for the domestic workers, usually they have the first 3 to 5 months of the salary so-called deducted from them. Why is this so? This is all to do with the migration industry. How does a migrant domestic worker come to Singapore? First, she doesn't have to pay a cent, supposedly pay a cent for that recruitment to Singapore, because the agent, the migrant agent, pays first, right? So, and often, I've also interviewed in Indonesian and Filipino villages. These agents will offer the families what's called shopping money. No extra money if you release your daughter or your wife to come and work in Singapore or Hong Kong or wherever it is, you can have this shopping money. And families who are, in a sense, need the money might take the money first, and the worker, the domestic worker, then, in a sense, journeys to Singapore and will then have to pay off by salary reduction. So for the first 3 to 5 months of a 2-year contract, she's usually paid $9 Singapore, and because the money is then, in a sense, already prepaid by the employer to the agent. So now the employer is recovering the money through salary deductions. Okay, so that was just a side issue. The main question is, why don't we do something about it? Why are the academics and NGOs not working with the government to do with this? This is, of course, a very complex question, and you need to understand the politics in Singapore. I would say that it's okay. It took the NGOs a very long time to even win the Day Off campaign, and they are continuing to try to, in a sense, see whether there are other ways of helping the situation. And one model that has been discussed more recently, and partly also provoked by the shortage during the pandemic, is live out domestic workers. So the point of view that I would share with the NGOs as well, that much of the difficulties and that domestic workers face has to do with their live-in condition. Because if you're living in, you are under someone else's roof, you are constantly at beck and call. So there's now discussion about a live-out system, where domestic workers are then treated as workers. They're brought in, they are paid a salary, and they work certain hours, and the rest of the time is their own time, like all of us, right? So that is one scheme that could hopefully work. In terms of, for someone like me who work with the NGOs, also discuss with the state, sometimes the state discussions have always been under closed door discussions because they're kind of quite sensitive to these kinds of issues. The NGOs have, I would say, a love-hate relationship with the state. Although more recently, the state itself has also been sponsoring some jingles, some sort of government-sponsored kind of organizations, like the ones that I showed in the slides. CDE is Center for Domestic Employees, and there's a newly set up so-called organization that is government supported, but does a lot of the work that NGOs do, like looking after abused domestics and so forth. The larger question is, of course, can we think of a different model for filling the care gap in Singapore? I think that one requires many fronts, one of which is that the Scandinavian system kind of work because care work is shared across the gender divide, and that is not the case in many Asian societies. So I think that's one major issue that has to be looked into. That care work cannot be just seen as women's work, or whether it's a Singaporean woman or the foreign woman to which the work is outsourced. Yeah, so that would be one. Two would be, it'd be important, given that Singapore is an aging society, that there are more institutional ways of caring for the elderly, but that comes across as culturally not acceptable, because most elderly want to, in a sense, age at home. They do not want to go to an institution. So there are also these cultural issues to be negotiated in order to come up with a more sustainable system of caring for the elderly.
Can I add a comment about the Scandinavian model?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe also it can be applied there. On the contract, there are working hours. So the au pair cannot be called anytime. So they work 7 hours a day, and the payment is stated there. So if they work overtime, they have to be paid. Although they are home after 7 hours, they are their own. And even also, of course, they can do some part-time, but they are not going to work for the family.
Yes. So I think that is an important issue, and to be realistic, that can only come if with a live-out system in Singapore. The live-in system is now so mired in so many different issues, very difficult to extract. But if there's a live-out system, which many Singaporean families also welcome, because it's also not everyone's cup of tea to have a stranger in your home, right? So that would be a way out.
The issue of CCTV that you mentioned, that's also interesting. Again, as far as my Scandinavian model, their families are not allowed to have that if they are going to recruit.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
I have maybe two questions. I don't know if, yes, maybe just submit them to. The first one would be about racial hierarchies you mentioned by passing, so I wanted to hear more about it. And the second is about the migration regimes you spoke about. I find it really interesting about those regional mobilities in Southeast Asia and Asia. And I wonder if you had some parallel to other areas in the world. I was thinking about the Middle East or the Gulf countries, where I think the same male-female divide could be seen, and also the dormitories and things like this.
Yeah. So let me take the second question first, which is to do with the idea that there are that to look at migration regimes, because I think the idea of a regime gives focus to power relations, to the norms that society accepts, and to the discourses that, in a sense, surround a particular topic. So to me, it's a nifty way to look at a holistic way of looking at different issues. And if you think about regimes, then it's very clear that the East Asian model, and by East Asian, I mean the global cities like Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, Korea, and Malaysia share this similar, although Korea has gone on a different tack altogether, but I won't talk about that. But there's a certain regime of power and norms and discourses that underlie these systems. And they share some similarities to the kafala system in the Middle East, where you need a sponsor to bring in the worker. And again, the worker is not considered a worker, it's considered like a helper or whatever it is. So, which is why we all resist the term domestic helper. I mean, so we've been insisting that I've corrected all my students' essays, right? Not helper, but worker, because she does real work. What was I trying to say? So, yeah, and there are similarities, but also some differences. And what's interesting is that domestic workers actually are multiple migrants, multi-destination migrants. So many of them will work this way, and it's in a sense a hierarchy. Indonesian workers tend to go to the Middle East, where it's easiest to go. I mean, they also think that sharing similar religion might be helpful to their acculturation, although that's not always true. And then further up the hierarchy would be places like Singapore. Malaysia is seen one step down. Conditions are even worse in Malaysia. But then the Hong Kong, Taiwan, and of course the dream destination is to be able to go to Canada, where there's the live-in caregiver system, which comes with permanent residency. So that is the hierarchical journey that many Filipino domestic workers undertake. The Indonesians are less likely to do that journey. Most of them would return back to Indonesia. They are, in a sense, less globalized. They are not as global. They are not the global workers that Filipinos tend to be. So that's a different hierarchy. On the race hierarchy, there's so many different issues there. So Singapore, as you know, is a multi-racial society. We have Chinese, Malay, Indian, and others. CMIO is the founding philosophy when Singapore became a nation state. Of course, these racial categories are hardened by colonial policies. I mean, the colonial policies treated each race differently, and we inherited that, and it's become part of the so-called DNA of Singapore society. So there's been many arguments about doing away with CMIO, very heated debates, but let's not go there yet. But what's interesting is that on top of CMIO, which are all citizens, there is a new layer of racial diversity coming from these temporary migrant workers, because they may or may not belong to CMIO. So they could be Bangladeshi Indians and not Singaporean Indians, right? Bangladeshis are Indians and not Singaporean Indians. So there is, many degrees of Indianness, for example, just like there are many degrees of Chineseness. So negotiating these racial categories is really quite complex. At the same time, I would say that in some ways, nationalism is a new racism, and that you would see that the temporary migrant workers, whichever nationality they belong to, whether it's the same as CMIO or not the same as CMIO, they belong to the lower end of the socioeconomic hierarchy. Because of their temporariness, they are not given the kinds of privileges that citizens and highly skilled migrants would have. So I can't, it'll take me another hour to explain the racial it's
50 Shades of Race.
Yes.
The big title of the book.
Yeah.
Thank you, Brenda. Thank
Okay. All right.
Yes.
Yeah.
So maybe it's time to.
Yeah. Thank you very much for, all your questions and for listening to this. I know it's a long way off from Europe and from France, but in some ways, the pandemic has made the world smaller in some ways. And some of these issues will be cross-cutting issues that we will face as humanity. Yeah.
Sorry.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.